One thing I've learned from watching 84 Frankenstein movies is that the gore factor has exploded exponentially over the years. But which of them are the goriest? Before we answer that question, let's dive into a little history. Back in 1931, when the classic Frankenstein movie starring Boris Karloff came out, the gore factor stood at 0, which was typical for horror movies at the time. And that's the way it was with all Frankenstein-themed movies for the next 25 years or so until 1957, when Hammer Film Productions got in on the act with The Curse of Frankenstein, starring Peter Cushing as Dr. Frankenstein. For the first time, audiences were treated to a level of gore previously unknown. The camera would linger on scenes containing that trademark Hammer Productions blood that looks suspiciously like red paint, and we got a peek at medical procedures like brain and eye transplants as well. All in all, Hammer produced 7 Frankenstein movies between 1947 and 1974, with all but one of them starring Peter Cushing. The gore in these films got progressively gorier, with several beheadings thrown in for good measure. But the gore was still not very convincing. In Hammer's final ode to the creature, Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, we are treated to an eye transplant and a brain transplant with a brain that looks more like anemic hamburger boiling in a pot of water, as well as some severed limbs, but nothing that today's audiences would find terribly disturbing. At the same time that Hammer was pumping out its pioneering Frankenstein gore, it got a little competition from pop artist Andy Warhol, who lent his name to a project called Flesh for Frankenstein that was released in 1973. This movie featured the same type of stylized gore that Hammer had become known for: red paint for blood and highly stylized, almost aesthetically pleasing sutures, and a lovely, almost blossom-like disembodied pair of lungs. But the Warhol film took things one step further, with more realistic-looking organ transplants, disembowelments galore, and one very odd scene showing a young Dr. Frankenstein getting off on handling his creature's liver. Ooh. Then, through the rest of the 70s, 80s, and most of the 90s, the gore was toned down quite a bit, and the emphasis in many Frankenstein movies was more philosophical or esoteric, like the 1992 version of Frankenstein starring Randy Quaid that focused on a psychic connection between Dr. Frankenstein and his monster. And 1974's Young Frankenstein, starring Gene Wilder, Marty Feldman, and Peter Boyle, kick-started a whole slew of Frankenstein comedies, like Rocky Horror Picture Show, starring Tim Curry, Susan Sarandon, and Meatloaf, or the 1990 indie film Frankenhooker, starring James Lawrence and Patty Mullen. Not to be outdone, the producers of kids' movies got in on the act as well, with heartwarming and comedic and non-gory Frankenstein movies, like Tim Burton's original live-action Frankenweenie from 1984, The Monster Squad in 1987, Frankenstein and Me in 1996, and many more. There was also a push for more faithful adaptations of Mary Shelley's original novel. These included 1997's Terror of Frankenstein, starring Leon Vitali and Per Oscarsson, and 1992's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, starring Kenneth Branagh, Helena Bonham Carter, and Robert De Niro. Although most of these were still pretty tame, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein infused its horror with more realism, such as this very graphic childbirth scene, some rather gruesome sutures on the creature and on Elizabeth Frankenstein's corpse, and this grisly scene where the monster rips out Elizabeth's still-beating heart. But that was nothing compared with what was to come. So, let us begin our countdown of the 6 goriest Frankenstein movies. At number 6, we have the 2013 independent movie Frankenstein's Army, a Dutch production filmed in Czechia that takes place in Russia. The idea is that Russian soldiers during World War II are being terrorized by an army of Frankensteins, half-human monsters that have had major body parts like their limbs and heads replaced by machines, screwdrivers and drills, kettles, and even an electric fan. This movie treats us to plenty of entrails, exploding heads, some more brain surgery with ketchup smeared on the plastic hamburger brains for greater effect, and scenes of people after they've had their brains removed. Still, nothing too terribly gruesome, and the gory scenes are few and far between. The movie stakes its horror factor more in the tension that's being created between the characters and on the inventiveness of the Frankensteins. At number 5, we have the indie film The Last Frankenstein, released in 2011. This film starts off at a breakneck pace with a child witnessing a predatory monster ripping people's limbs off and throwing their heads up in the air while the child runs for cover. Then the gore gives way to plot and the buildup of tension, which are only occasionally punctuated by scenes like this very grisly surgical face removal, or this bloody suturing scene. A lot of the other violence in the movie is implied, or it happens so fast that you don't really see it. There is a bloodbath at the end, but we don't find out until the very end whether it's the monster or the grizzly bear that shed the blood. That's right, grizzly bear. Then, at number 4 is another indie film, 2011's Frankenstein, Day of the Beast. This movie leads off with blood and gore, setting the tone for terror with a decapitation, another girl having her mouth sewn shut, and an impalement. Once the tension has become established, though, the attacks become a bit fewer and farther between, but there's always a sense of dread and waiting for the other shoe to drop, which it does do, just often enough to keep us on the edge of our seats. We have a priest being impaled and disemboweled, a monster who comes to life inside a wrapping of very bloody bandages, and who gets blown up, and my favorite part, his blown off limbs come to life on their own and start terrorizing everyone. Kind of reminds me of The Sorcerer's Apprentice in Disney's Fantasia, where the apprentice tries to stop the magical broom from carrying water, but every time he chops it in two, both halves come to life and keep carrying water until the poor apprentice is practically drowning. That's taken the indestructibility of Frankenstein's monster to a whole new level. Now, if you felt at all squeamish about what you've seen so far, this might be a good point to turn back and watch one of our other Frankenstein videos while there's still a chance. For the rest of you, let's move on to number 3. We really start getting into the gore fest with 2013's Frankenstein's Hungry Dead. This is a teen horror movie that mixes gore and comedy and does a fairly good job of it. Although, like some others in this video, it did end up on my list of all-time worst Frankenstein films, mostly because of the horrible acting and the weak script. It's about a bunch of teens trapped in a wax museum with a crazed Frankenstein, and once the scene is set, it's all about non-stop gore. We've got teens sliding around in blood, and we've got skulls being torn off, and we've got zombies yanking out and eating entrails. A lot. I mean, a lot. It's a veritable zombie entrails picnic. And for dessert, the zombies have a bit of tongue, which looks a bit like cranberry sauce. And by the way, I was eating cranberry sauce when I was watching this. You don't want to do that. Don't see this movie at Thanksgiving. By the time you get to see the actual Frankenstein, or the main one anyway, the gore fest is over and the survivors, the few that there are, get to go home. The second Goriest Frankenstein movie on our list is the 2005 indie Frankenstein Reborn, starring Rhett Giles. Early on, we see a girl's legs being pulled off and her mutilated body tied up in a room full of disembodied limbs. This scene is repeated much later in the movie as the detectives trying to solve the case of a number of gruesome murders hone in on their suspect. After this, we see a few of these grisly murders up close and personal, including a decapitation and a couple more limbs being torn off. I don't know about you, but these scenes look uncomfortably realistic to me. Maybe because of my history, you know? But the really scary thing about this movie is that we're not always sure if the murders are being committed by the monster or by the good doctor himself. The doc is certainly no stranger to gore, as we can see in this detailed surgical scene that focuses not only on the viscera, but on the bloody surgical instruments and even the blood draining down the sink. If red is your favorite color, this is the movie for you. And finally, we have this nice close-up of the monster's face as the good doctor pours acid on it. A nice way to round out the movie, don't you think? And now, for the moment you've all been waiting for, our number 1 goriest Frankenstein movie ever, a Japanese movie released in 2009, Vampire Girl vs. Frankenstein Girl. This movie is a love story and it has pretty much every type of gore imaginable. And it just doesn't let up. A dark comedy that seems to be a parody of Japanese teen culture, the gore and laughs are mixed together in a rapid-fire sequence that will leave your head spinning. It had me hollering out loud and closing my eyes from the get-go. Here's just a sampling. We have Frankenstein Girl getting her face ripped off by a bloody skull. Then we have her own bloody skull popping out of her head with a nice spattering of CGI blood. And what horror movie would be complete without the school nurse gleefully chopping up bodies with an axe and a sickle? But that's not all. This school has a group of self-harming girls who join a wrist-cutting tournament, and they take it down to the bone. And a fall from the rooftops kills one of the girls, who ends up lying in a pool of her own blood, and that just serves to highlight her loveliness for this Valentine's Day movie. Aww. The laboratory of the mad scientist who puts her back together again, and just happens to be her father, who says, what father wouldn't dream of cutting up his own daughter and putting her back together again, is filled with an interesting mix of organic and inorganic materials. That comes in handy when you're taking parts from one person and transplanting them into another. Although a lung transplant from a habitual smoker doesn't seem like the best way to start out. But whatever else happens in this movie, you just know that at every turn, there's going to be lots of spattering blood, exploding heads, and the serving up of just dues from a jealous lover. I can't think of a better movie to take your sweetheart to on Valentine's Day, can you? If you've enjoyed this little review of Frankenstein Gore, click here for more on Frankenstein. I'll see you there, and remember to keep coming back for more cinema rolls. They're good for you.